GPU market is going crazy, and we've got yet another new graphics card to take a look at. This time it's the AMD Radeon RX 7600 XT, a card with a whopping 16 gigabytes of VRAM that promises great 1080p and 1440p gaming performance in a power-efficient package that costs just $329. Have AMD finally delivered the great value card we've all been waiting for? In this video, I'll be finding out by building the best $1,000 gaming PC around the new 16GB 7600 XT. Let's do this. The Cooler Master Cube 500 flat pack is a case that lets you do it yourself with support for full-size specs in a compact form factor. A highly adjustable design lets you build as you unbox, and it really is like nothing else. What's more, support for up to E80X motherboards, 360mm long GPUs, and a 280mm AIO up top make it super versatile for the latest components. Build it your way with the Cooler Master Cube 500, now available in black, white, and macaron. Check it out at the first links in the description below. In the mix of all the hype and attention around Nvidia's new 40 series GPU, the 7600 XT has kind of swam under the radar. Announced at CES alongside AMD's Ryzen 8000 APUs, this could actually be the card we've all been kind of asking for. Now it comes in with an MSRP of $329. That's around about $60 more than the MSRP for the standard 8GB version. Now in many respects I get a bit of deja vu here as to when Nvidia released their 4060 Ti. It was a capable card but didn't have nearly enough video memory. The difference though, and the lesson that AMD seem to have learnt from Nvidia, to be frank, is that we want more VRAM but we don't want to pay an extra $100 or $150 for the privilege. In fact, AMD have been quite clever with their positioning of this card in that it costs about $30 more at MSRP than the RTX 4060 while delivering better performance and better VRAM. In fact, in our historical testing, the 7600 was more aligned at times with the 4060 Ti, and the 8GB variant of that card comes in for around about $70 more than this. So I think AMD have positioned this thing actually quite well. Other than the original RX 7600 design, we're not really seeing any major changes to the specifications. The number of compute units, the ray tracing capability, all stays the same on the 7600 XT with its 16 gigs of VRAM compared to the 7600 with its 8GB. And they're not the only key metrics to stay the same. The memory bus, which is 128 bits on this card, has stayed the same over the original design. And it's the problem that AMD and Nvidia have both run into. You might think that 16 gigs is overkill for this card, which it is, but because of that bus, they're only able to increase the VRAM in 8GB increments. There's no ability to put 12 gigs of VRAM on this card without a different memory bus, something which would prompt a much wider redesign. AMD then have taken the hit by adding the extra VRAM. 16 gigs is more than their more expensive RX 7700 XT, and of course, notably more than the new RTX 4070 Super. Granted, a much more powerful card, but one that's been criticised for not stepping up from 12 to 16 gigabytes. In our benchmarking, we are seeing this amount of VRAM become useful. Now, the full 16 gigs is not going to get saturated on a card like this at 1440p. It's simply not quite powerful enough. But in certain titles, we're still seeing usage that goes well above the 8 gigs on the original card. The memory change here helping to alleviate the biggest bottleneck and flaw with the original design. Now, we'll look at the memory bandwidth in particular later on in the benchmarks and see if we are constrained by the speed and throughput to the memory as opposed to the capacity. For now though, we should go ahead and just take a closer look at this Gigabyte card and then talk about the best parts to pair it up with if you're after a great value PC build right now. This Gigabyte gaming OC design's got 3 fans, which should really help with cooling. It isn't super compact, but it's hardly mega large, staying pretty much within the 2-stop form factor. As far as our I/O goes at the rear, 2 display ports and 2 HDMIs. I would have rathered 3 display ports and 1 HDMI personally, but it's not a huge gripe and won't cause you really any issues. And then as far as power consumption goes, we've got 2 8-pin power connections here. This allows the board power to jump from 165 to 190 watts, enabling a modest factory overclock compared to the original 7600. Much like lots of large cooler designs, the board actually ends here at the end of the power connectors. All this extra bit is additional heatsink and heat pipes to of course allow room for the 3rd fan and ultimately lead to better cooling. You get little accents of RGB, and the grey and black Gigabyte colour scheme as we've come to know it is pretty good. It's not going to clash with really any build aesthetic you might go for. Talking of which, what are we actually going to pair this card up with, and what should you pair a card like this up with to achieve great 1080p and hopefully great 1440p gaming performance? Well, of course, at the budget end, AMD's kind of the go-to platform right now, and it makes sense to go for an AMD CPU and GPU where you can, especially on the budget end, as we get access to a thing called Smart Access Memory. Now, you might think the 16 gigs on the GPU is wildly overkill, But smart access memory is going to allow our CPU to tap into some of the GPU's memory. And if the 7600 XT does have quite a bit spare, which we think it will, that's a feature that's potentially even more useful. For an AMD platform, we of course need an AMD motherboard, and this ASRock B650M Pro RS is a great shout. You can get it with or without Wi-Fi. You've got PCIe Gen 5 support for your M.2 SSD as standard. With this being AMD, you'll obviously have to step up to a more expensive B650 Extreme board for Gen 5 PCIe for the graphics card. Not that we're actually going to need it for this build anyway. And you get all the features that one might expect from a board at this price point, whether that be the 4 RAM DIMMs with support for dual-channel DDR5 memory, 3 M.2 slots, one here, and one over on the bottom corner of the board for loads of storage expandability, and room to add the Wi-Fi in if you didn't go for the Wi-Fi version by default. The rear I/O shield is also integrated, which is a really nice touch at this price point. We've got ourselves 2.5 gig LAN, a nice fast USB-C and A port, and then standard USB 3 ports throughout. You'll also notice this board is the smaller micro ATX form factor, helping us to save money and keep the overall size and scale of the build down just a little bit. Really a massive fan of ASRock boards at the budget end. There aren't many people who come close to competing on price with ASRock. CPU-wise, obviously going for Ryzen as mentioned earlier, specifically the AMD Ryzen 5 7600 Non-X. That's right, this build's got a 7600 CPU and a 7600 XT GPU. That's not confusing at all, AMD. But in terms of putting the CPU in, pretty easy, just got to be careful of those pins around the CPU socket itself. Lift up the arm, lift up the socket cover, and drop the processor in. Get all those triangles lined up, make sure the Ryzen text reads upright from the front of the board, and add the cover back into place. The black plastic is going to pop off, but keep this safe if you ever sell your board, have to RMA it, you get the gist. RAM-wise, I've gone for an Expo kit. This is a 32GB CORSAIR Vengeance kit. Expo is basically the AMD equivalent of Intel XMP. It means you can overclock the memory really easily and make sure all the profiles align. That's particularly important for AMD, as the RAM is actually way more important to performance than Intel. Getting a low latency, high-speed kit for that Ryzen 7000 architecture makes a massive difference in games, and it's not an area you particularly want to scrimp. This Corsair kit looks the part. I like the grey colour scheme with the RGB on top, and it's not going to cost you a fortune. Talking of things that won't cost you a fortune, storage is next up. This is the Crucial P3 Plus, and it's sort of my favourite Gen 4 budget-oriented NVMe right now. Available in loads of capacities, 500 gig, a terabyte, 2 terabytes, 4 terabytes. This is the standard 1 terabyte drive and will set you back well under $100. For a build like this, where we've only got about $1,000 to play with, this is a perfect choice and makes, trust me, so much sense. As far as installation goes, it's pretty easy. Just slide the M.2 drive into the top slot for this build, push it down, then add the heatsink back on. That's going to keep the drive cool and do a good job of securing it into place for good measure. The only thing really then that remains is the CPU cooler. Now for this, I've gone for DeepCool's AK400. I'd primarily recommend the Zero Dark, but you can also buy the Zero Dark Plus. And to be honest, the only difference is you get an extra fan on the Plus model versus the non-Plus model. Now, that's not to say the extra fan isn't worth it, but I'm not sure we necessarily need it for the AMD Ryzen 5 7600. Got such a low TDP and this cooler's so good as it is, save the money and just go for the one fan one, which will look a little something like this. In terms of installation, DeepCool make things actually really quite easy. All you have to do is add these orange stoppers, I suppose, over each of the posts around the CPU chip itself. Then grab the black included mounting plate, which should look a little something like this, and secure the whole thing down with the screws that come included in a little bag within your CPU cooler's box. And what this is going to do is going to allow you a secure place on which to install the CPU tower cooler itself. All that then remains is to pop a drop of thermal paste onto the CPU. As I say, you'll get a tube included in the box for the cooler. This part can be a little bit messy, and then actually take the cooler itself and just drop it onto that mounting plate we just installed. Get the screws lined up. You can start screwing them down just with your fingers, I suppose, to begin with, and then use a screwdriver thread to get them nice and torqued and make sure that the contact between the cooler and the processor is hunky-dory. Repeat this for obviously both sides of the cooler. Try not to tighten one up fully, do them bit by bit, and just get the whole thing nice and secure. You should then at this stage be able to safely lift the whole thing by just the tower cooler itself. That board feels really secure, definitely isn't going anywhere. Now that allows us to move the completed motherboard assembly into the case. And again, DeepCool win my recommendation with this, their CH370. Now this is by no means the flashiest, most fancy PC case. In fact, quite the opposite. But what it is a micro ATX tower case with good cooling, plenty of mesh ventilation, and the ability to look really good with a couple of thoughtful component choices. Keeping everything tied into a black theme and in some RGB fans, there really is a lot you can do with a chassis like this. this. That isn't to say there aren't a few cool features. You can actually pull the front panel to give you a number of different aesthetic options, depending on how you like your look. And on the side of the case, you actually have an integrated headphone hanger, which you can push out, and it's great. Like, really, really secure, does a great job, and it just pops back in when you don't need it. Strip the case down in terms of taking both side panels off. That's going to allow for really easy access to the components and make the build process that bit easier. With this being a Micro ATX motherboard inside a Micro ATX case, it should just be a nice easy job of sliding the board into place. That's the beauty of like an integrated rear I/O shield now. It just makes this set so foolproof. I definitely can't get this wrong after saying it's foolproof. No, we should be fine. Just align it up. There we are. Are we going to go in? Nearly. Aha. A couple of the standoffs are raised, so that will hold it temporarily into place while I actually finish screwing it in. And I am going to add the fan on afterwards as well to the cooler when I don't need access to those motherboard screws anymore. Next up then is the graphics card. Now we'll be taking a look at performance for this in just a moment, but first let's actually install it. Now I was a little bit worried earlier about clearance in the case, but now I'm a bit more close. We're going to be totally fine. Let me just show you roughly what I mean. There's loads of room. You can even put a radiator at the front if you wanted to. I'm going to add a couple of RGB fans in, but even then there's still going to be loads of room to spare. Now looking at the motherboard, and I think we've got a couple of PCI lanes missing from a previous build I did on the channel. Check that out in the card section now, but these are actually in the wrong place. We need to move the one at the top down to the third slot, as our graphics card will occupy the top 2 slots in this build. But I think as long as our PCI slot is all ready to go, it should just be a case of sliding the card in. Yes, lovely stuff. Couple of screws just to actually secure it into place and stop that from happening. And then we're pretty much good to move on to the power supply. Talking of which, I've stuck with the DeepCool theme, but for no other reason than because it makes sense the most financially. This is the PF700, and it's a pretty bare bones, pretty basic, budget 800 watt power supply. It's only got an 80 plus white certification, which is the lower end or the bottom of the 80 plus spectrum, and it isn't modular, meaning we have, unfortunately, all of this to deal with, but it's gonna save us some serious cash, and it's gonna do a pretty good job, really, when it comes to keeping the card in this build nice and cool. The cable issue will become less problematic once we actually separate out the ones we need versus the ones we don't. So we want the motherboard cable, we need a pair of PCI power connectors, probably also going to need a SATA harness for all our RGB cables and connections too, and then of course a CPU power connector, of which there is, this is CPU, yes. We've got dual 4+4 pins, so 2 8 pins that we can leverage for the processor. The rest, by the looks of things, we aren't going to need. So once these cables are all in, the power supply screwed in, we should be able to manage these without too much bother. Going to wire up the motherboard first, followed by the CPU in the top left corner, and then of course the graphics card itself. I would have liked to have got some cable extensions for this build, but it's another $30 or $40 I just didn't really want to spend. All that remains then is to boot this thing up and see how well the 7600 XT fares, and whether or not you should actually buy one. Through into performance, and I've been particularly intrigued to see how the 7600 XT stacks up, with very similar on-paper specifications to that of the original 7600, barring of course the extra VRAM and slight factory overclock, and I wasn't expecting a great deal, and to be honest, that's kind of what I got. At Starfield 1440p high, the RX 7600 XT 16GB achieved 58 FPS on average. This was 6 FPS more than the original RX 7600, demonstrating actually one of the larger performance improvements in our testing. Here the extra VRAM clearly proving a little bit useful. Move into Apex Legends and you start to see that advantage diminish slightly. The 7600 XT here at 1440p high, delivering 149 FPS on average. That's just 4 FPS more than the original RX 7600. But admittedly, Apex isn't a game where extra VRAM is particularly top of the priority list. Hogwarts Legacy at 1440p high is next, and here once again we see a small bump in frame rate, but certainly nothing that's going to break any world records. The 7600 XT achieving 66 FPS on average, 2 frames per second more than the original RX 7600. In Cyberpunk 2077, you'd expect to see perhaps a bigger uplift here, given how AAA and graphic intensive Cyberpunk is. All those textures surely must mean the extra 8 gigs of VRAM makes a difference. Well, I'm afraid to say it's not moving the needle particularly much. From 59 FPS on the non-XT version to 62 frames per second on this new 7600 XT. Fortnite, one of our esports titles, again you'll be unsurprised to see a very minimal change in frame rate, 276 FPS on the XT versus 273 on the vanilla non-XT version. Move through into Warzone at 1440p high, DLSS and FSR set to quality on their respective AMD and Nvidia cards, the 7600 XT pulling in 131 FPS, actually a fairly sizable jump over the non-XT version with 121, showing where that extra VRAM can really be useful. Call of Duty's Modern Warfare 2 was next on our testing lineup, 1440p high settings here, and the 7600 XT delivered 141 FPS on average, a change of just 3 frames per second over the original non-XT 7600. I couldn't leave you all either without a good sim benchmarking game, Formula 1 2022, rather than 2023 as we have a wider dataset here, and the 7600 XT delivered only a 2 FPS increase over the original 7600. This card is a really tricky one for me, because obviously the original 7600 non-XT was clearly lacking in VRAM, and for only $60 more, you can't say that AMD are exactly trying to rip people off with the extra 8 gigs here, especially compared to Nvidia, who whacked a far more hefty $100 premium on the price tag. With that being said, the memory bus and the bandwidth on offer simply isn't fast enough to leverage the extra VRAM afforded to you by this card. And while it might be nice to have this option, especially in years to come as games come to devour more and more video memory, I can't help but feel that without the extra bandwidth, the extra VRAM is kind of not that handy. It's nice to have the option, but for 1080p and even a bit of 1440p gaming, the original 7600 works just fine. What do you guys think of this card? Let me know in the comments below. Check out all our reviews linked in the description. If you enjoyed this one, get subscribed, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.